Welcome everyone to the fifth monthly seminar of creatures. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the project, like creatures look at how creative practices can contribute to social and ecological transformation towards sustainability. And as part of this is we are working with a number of artists who are looking at different types of creative practice, but also like they are running different projects. But I think one of the underlying directions that we see having is a kind of like growing interest and a growing work of artists that has to do with like how it's possible to understand like other than human and create this like more than human relations with other species, which is why we are very happy to have Špela Petrič with us today. Špela is a media artist with a background in biomedicine and also arts. She is based between Ljubljana and Amsterdam, and her work is precisely looking at this kind of like multi-species endeavors by focusing on plants in like the very different connections that we can build with them. So I won't say much more because she will obviously introduce her work much better than I can. So she will give a presentation and we will have a short discussion at the end. So please prepare your questions for that. Welcome, Špela. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Christina, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to all you guys. I must say that my experience of working in this question or within the field of having sort of a social impact is really at the ground level to understand what exactly it is that we should be doing, where to put our efforts, right? And so my practice, even though I have a background in science, I've been actually working as an artist now for the past 10 years and making art as both a way to experiment with concepts, to allow the artworks to answer some questions, but also to see how these works have sort of a life of their own and how they impact then the audiences and what kind of reactions they draw out. So it's a sort of ongoing process. So today I would like to talk about this latest project that I've been involved in. It's actually this wider investigation of the plant machine, for which I am actually currently on a postdoc associated with VU, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and the Rietveld Academy, along with Zone to Source, V2, and VAG. So these are all institutions based on the Netherlands, and it's really about bringing together these different domains to answer pertinent social questions. In this case, our research is based around the question of plants, their representation in both the ecological sense as well as in the cultural domain, specifically in relation to algorithmic cultures and these machinic realities, which I think reflect much of our current situation. I mean, we could just look at what the pandemic has brought about, a completely new way of organizing society through basically information that is extracted, analyzed statistically, and then somehow societies are organized based on numbers we don't really have direct access to. So this is basically what happens in the lives of most agricultural plants, in the lives of most plants that we have in our backgrounds, quite literally at this moment. And so this is what I would like to kind of talk about, how I came to understanding the intimacy between plants and machines, and also how working with plants for me is basically understanding humans, ourselves, as a plant as well. So I would say the question of algorithms appeared a couple of years ago in 2015, 2016, when my partner Miha Turšić and I applied for a FEAT residency, Future Emerging Art and Technology, which actually brought together FET projects, so Future Emerging Technology projects that were funded by the Horizon 2020. And there was a really interesting format where we met in a sort of matchmaking session, artists and these representatives of these high tech and science and technology research groups. And it was this situation where the groups presented their work, and it was up to us artists to choose which group was most intriguing and most stimulating. So George Beckett from Eindhoven, from the EPCC, sort of a supercomputing or high performance computing center, made a pitch, which was a bit dry in general, I must admit. But he mentioned that actually these computers, all these computational capacities that are used to simulate, to model the environment, have such a stark environmental impact through just the energy they consume, that if one of these computer centers was asked to calculate the current weather conditions in its environment, the calculation itself would change the weather condition. So I think that was sort of the hook. We understood that regardless of how dry and away from this embodied experience computation might seem, it is becoming increasingly important. We need to roll up the sleeves and engage with this. So we actually traveled to many of these centers, trying to understand what motivates them, how they also see this connection to society. So these are mostly computer scientists that are working really at the low level, the architecture of how to perform these computations in parallel, and how actually it's almost about prestige to have the computer that performs these calculations the fastest. And so kind of like the space race, we had the situation of this high performance computing race between Europe, China, and America, who has the fastest. So it was kind of funny in many ways. But while we were in Edinburgh, we tried to somehow grasp this situation, which we didn't have access to hands-on. Neither of us are programmers. And we struggled on how to actually approach this from the knowledge that they have. So one of the things we tried to do was talk to scientists.
What is the weight of data? The weight of data, that's a really good question. It's stored on disks and on solid state drives, so if you really want to quantify the weight of data, then you might have to weigh the disks or the solid state drives where it's stored on. Mm-hmm. And the actual data are electronic molecules, so they don't have weight, I think.
That's a difficult one to answer. It depends where you're coming from. You could take it as sorry, I can't answer this briefly because it depends how you interpret the question. It depends where you interpret it literally as, right? If you actually put all the data in a bucket, how much it would weigh. You could interpret it in terms of its psychological, emotional effects, whatever, in terms of just the masses of data that people see nowadays, and what that means to them in their everyday lives. So I would say, so my answer then is, it depends on quite what the meaning of the word weight is as to how it would actually properly answer the question.
So we actually took this suggestion also quite literally. Took a 32 gigabyte SD card, asked a programmer to write all zeros. We went to this super precise scale, we weighed it. Then we asked to overwrite the zeros with random zeros and ones, and we went back and weighed it again. We got this small number. And okay, that was a nice gesture, but then we asked ourselves, what exactly was it that we were weighing? What was this data? Was it information? Was it even data? And of course, in a similar manner, we asked the computer to try to decipher what this actually meant. So we took the binary, which were zeros and ones of these random zeros and ones, translated that to ASCII code, used the computer to pronounce the ASCII codes from in the text-to-speech manner, and then another computer was listening to it. And then this process of speech-to-text, text-to-speech was repeated several times until we got some meaning from it. So this is one of the results.
Still the left bracket, /4x, 1 \greater than k, /Julio k people, at THA coolest KW, 62 ~JH conversions to YOK people, at THA coolest KW, 62 ~JH conversions to 120 WDB.
Algorithmic entities are fed with unexpected inputs, and they're asked to make sense of them. This outcome is further processed with another algorithm, yet another technological interface. What we get is an emergence of meaning that does not have the sense that it was intended for.
I see a beautiful mountain, snow-capped, with the green forest slightly displayed. It must be the springtime. Underneath I see a pond to the left side. A deep pond with cold water because the snow melted.
So actually this last bit it's from sort of an installation performance where we basically have this congress of actors, different types of algorithms and elements that are associated with big data, supercomputing, predictive algorithms, and so forth. And this last bit is actually a service offered by Amazon called the Mechanical Turk, or the artificial intelligence, where people are, for a very small amount of money, asked to do these tasks that are easy for humans but still difficult for computers. And this is actually some of this invisible labor that goes into the construction or the teaching of these algorithms that then appear to perform things that are beyond human cognition, beyond human capacity. But they're actually quite, they are the result of immense human labor, so that at the end we might look at them as if they perform a magic trick. So overall, our initial approach to the algorithmic was trying to understand, sort of to grasp the basics of it in a rather, in a rather naive way, from the outside, and basically speaking to the experts, to the scientists that have been working with these algorithms their whole lives, and realizing that we actually, in essence, pose very different questions. So when you ask these scientists, what is the impact of algorithms on society, they hadn't really thought about it. They say that it remains as the fourth pillar of science, or the third pillar of science. So aside from observation, in experimentation, you have simulation. But the social consequences are not something they would think about. And while this was a really nice way to introduce ourselves to some of the bigger questions in algorithmic cultures, it wasn't yet a project where we would really get our hands dirty, where we could really use supercomputers. And in fact, 2 projects in, because we did another one, which was titled Becoming Ecological. This one was called Becoming a Thing. We still haven't gotten to the point where we would actually need to use a supercomputer. So I think that is kind of an interesting aspect, right? Like what kind of knowledges, what kind of specialities need to come together to be able to address a technology, not only from afar, but that you are really immersed in it, to sort of feel it and to be able to reflect on it from a position of the user, rather than this distance position of a theoretician. And so this is where what we are sort of slowly working on. So the other field of interest, or I would say even the primary field of my artistic interest, have been plants. And since, I guess, almost the beginning of my art practice, I have been kind of puzzled by them, especially how the way that they are organized, the way that they live, and the way that culture sees them. They always seem to meld into the background, even though they are so constitutional to basically all of life on Earth. We hardly treat them any difference as basically living material, as a resource to be tapped into. And I think even now with these ecological changes happening, we are still to find a different approach to plant life, one that would sort of mediate climate change in the long run and not just immediate sort of patching of problems such as this carbon offsetting and stuff like this, which is really myopic. Anyway, coming from the sciences, I wanted to think of how not only why we have come to this type of relationship with plants, because it's of course based on hierarchies that we have inherited in the Western metaphysics, but also how could these relationships be enacted anew in a strange way, in a strange enough way that it would allow sort of a reflection on what drives this relationship. How do we possibly overcome this difference that is present? So that's how the Confronting Vegetal Otherness opus was conceived. So basically, plants in the Western metaphysical tradition lack autonomy, individuality, self-identity, originality, and essentiality. And this is kind of hard to argue. But this does not necessarily mean that they are somehow less capable of being in the world, and that they are simpler because of this. In fact, in many instances, we can sort of view plants as having, you know, just as much or even more agency as humans. And it really highly depends on how we conceive of the plant. And so this opus was also not only about constructing these relationships, these new strange relationships between plants and humans, but really looking at how this also changes depending on which level of organization you look at, right? So the most contested one, the human and the plant as individuals, shows the biggest difference, because seemingly we understand what the human individual is, since this is, let's say, one of our most direct accesses. We have most access, or we have been told and taught that this is what we have most access to. But then on the other hand, the level of cells in culture is something completely different. And so is sort of a longer, deeper time relationship between plants and people, where they have been constitutional for basically the way we live. Just think of agriculture. So in Scotopoiesis, I stood in front of Cress for 20 hours, performing this sort of biosemiosis to prove that there was intercognition going on. As I saw the crest also recognized my presence by changing its shape and color. And this was enacting this weird position where the human individual actually doesn't quite, needs proof and doesn't quite understand the vivaciousness of plants. But in fact, this surrendering to the plant in this particular action opened a lot of different points of view. So it was transformative, not only for the crest, but also for my whole approach to plants. In phytoteratology, I was looking at transgression of species boundaries, and through the use of biotechnological methods and protocols, created phytopollutants, plant-human monsters, which are basically embryos that were not conceived in plant embryos, that didn't arise from seeds, but rather they were conceived in embryos with hormones that I had isolated from my urine, informing their development. So in a sort of biofeminist, strange reclamation of ectogenesis, just to see actually what kind of relationships actually evolve. And I would say that, in fact, the presence of the molecular protocols are the more dominating feature of this. So it was less about me and the plant and more about the interface, the machine, which was quite humbling and very informative. And then finally, in Strange Encounters, it was about a meeting between an algae, Nanochloropsis, which represented plants, and cancer cells of the bladder extracted from the woman in a woman in the early 90s that was representing the human. And they met under a microscope and eventually sort of formed this strange form, I don't know, where the cancer cells incorporated some of the algae. Maybe they were digesting them. Maybe this was the first step towards an endosymbiosis. We don't know. We didn't really follow. But it was interesting because people objected to cancer cells representing human. Nobody really said that algae aren't really representative of plants. There was something very strange going on, and it points to the fact that humans in tissue culture are very much treated as material. And cancer cells or immortalized cells are actually the workhorses of molecular biology and tissue engineering. This is where actually most of the experiments are done on. And they're sort of a completely different species. They don't necessarily behave in the similar manner as human cells, as cells in this body ecology. And yet they do represent us in many ways. Okay. So basically, those are the two parts of my artistic research that have led me to Jeffrey Nealon, who actually also says that, I'm sorry, just a sec, I'll try to, oops, no. I can't see my screen. Okay, basically he says the vegetable is an image of thought that far better characterizes our biopolitical present than does the human animal image of life, which remains tethered to the organism, the individual with its hidden world, or hidden, I can't see it, life and its projected world. Basically, it struck me that in many ways, how this crisis that we experience is about coming to terms that the humanist conception of what it is to be human, and also how this separates us from the rest of life on Earth, is not really how things work. And again, coming to the pandemic, we are seeing sort of some of this. And this kind of led me to develop or expand on a concept on a term that was invented by Catriona Sandlands called the Vegetariat. So this is my text. From the perspective of surveillance capitalism, our ontological opposite is no longer the plant, but the idea of a self-determining human whose boundaries are delimited by the surface of the skin. In the eyes of algorithms, our cherished interiority is held in leaky vessels so that it appears as flat and superficial as the vegetable kingdom, like a transparent object of tabulation. So this is somehow it captures sort of the sentiment of the human individual living as a part of this bigger data double of the possibility of having our lives extracted in little bits and somehow have that organized and fed back to us in a way that works, that it doesn't completely capture our life experience, nor all the possibilities there are for a future, but it does effectively direct us. So there's an element of first coming to terms with that, yes, this is how it works. And then the second element, which is what can we do about it? What should be done about it? And in my world, this vegetariat is also a liberating concept, because from this perspective, I find plants no longer as the opposite or as the subaltern that needs to be raised from the background to the level of the human, but rather plants as flattened ontologically as much as we are. And the question then becomes, how do we make allies with plants? And what are their strategies? How have they been able to survive under these circumstances, and oftentimes thrive as well? What is it within these humanistic values that we can let go of in order to be able to live better? So the answer for me, sort of, again, kind of like the confronting vegetal otherness opus, there's a couple of points that I want to follow. The first thing is about forming posses, and posses are not, so the Vegetariat can't afford grand ideas. It's all about dealing with the concrete associations, and trying to basically make do. So these posses are made up of plants, people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and in certain contexts that are funded in certain ways, that are caught in these streams of consumption and production, but nevertheless work together towards different futures, improvised futures. And as a guide, this resistance that comes from the feminist concept of the erotic. Because like Audre Lorde says, in touch with the erotic, we are less likely to fall prey to these powers that be. It's actually very difficult. to completely subsume actors that are in touch with the erotic. The improvised future, this is just a beautiful example of how possibly to work with this machine without necessarily hacking into the black box. Waze is a company kind of like Google Maps that basically it's a service, it's a navigational service, gathers data from users and then directs you along the quickest path. And this is an Israeli company, but it's used all around the world. So in Paris, for example, they had big problems because Waze was directing traffic into residential areas, into areas that the municipality decided should be kind of low traffic. It was dangerous because of schools, because they needed quiet, they needed good air quality. However, there was nothing that the municipality could do to directly change the algorithm. And this is a funny situation, but what they ended up doing was actually making the streets in the residential area really slow. So they would install traffic lights and put these speed bumps on it. So essentially, the algorithms were influenced by interventions in the real world. And I think this is quite an important realization when it comes to questioning the impacts of algorithmic cultures. They operate in reality, and they are actually in a way open to continuous changes. They work with indeterminable sets of data. They are actors in this new type of social construct, but they are not fixed. And so this, I think, offers a sliver of opportunity to actually reclaim the relationship of these algorithms, which is somehow how I would like to also approach this as a way of investigating the possibilities of living in this world. It's not that I think AI does not have, it doesn't bring to the table an inherent bias. It's basically, as Flavia Zodan says, the singularity where the white European male transferred its consciousness into the machine. It's true, but we cannot afford not to engage. So the question is, what exactly do we do, and how do we play with this fire in a way that not only we don't get burned, but neither does our goal. So plants, in a way, working in this constellation where we have artificial intelligence, machines, and plants, is a bit provocative from the get-go, because this is so mundane. Plants have anyway been part of this type of observation, total control, total transparency, reduced to their to the material for yes, very, very long time. And I think it's intensifying as we go along. So the question is, what is it that we need to understand better about this relationship? So in this plant machine series of works, I really emphasized the notion of working together with these experts, or in this case, they're engineers and programmers, to take the time to build relationships between these actors that finally develop an artwork. So it's all beyond taking care of the plants. It's also about spending time together in order to understand better the position that they are coming from, both as people as well as representatives or workers in certain domains. So this is the posse, and I would won't go so much into the previous editions with the lip reader or the Vegetariat work 0, but show you, sorry, this is gonna try to play. I'll just stop it. I would like to show you a video that was produced by Kapelica Gallery on the occasion of the COVID non-opening of Play, which is one of the projects, the latest project that was developed within share screen within this Play. Here we go. Share. It's 10 minutes long. Play is about a game between an AI. To make this happen, we built a robot that is controlled by an artificial intelligence that sees the cucumber plants growing beneath it with a 3D scanner, a LiDAR, a camera. And as the cucumber plant grows and, of course, moves by growing, the robot is watching it carefully and also making sort of a mental image of the cucumber. And in response to the mental image, it moves its own tendrils. The cucumber has tendrils with which it tries to...
Sorry, I think that the sound is quite low.
And in this case, we designed the robot so that it has tendrils of its own. And these are wires with colorful bulbs at the end of them, which the robot controls according to its own intention. And the intention is actually to try to play a game with the growing cucumbers. And this game is not necessarily defined with a pre-given framework that is based on...
Can you start the video again? It's not playing.
Set goal that we as humans would...
The video is not playing.
No?
No.
Sorry. So... Let's see if it... But rather, it's about the possibility for an ontological testing and expression. Okay. Did this work on the second time?
No, it was again stuck at a different frame.
Okay, so let's then stop, not try to get the video to work because it's also published. I will send you a link, or actually I will ask Simon, who's also on the chat, to send a link perhaps to the video and the whole discussion that was recorded for the friction bar. And I will maybe just say something about the work so you have an idea about what it was about. Okay. So let's see. So Play is an artwork that considers how an AI, this AI-controlled robot, would, instead of trying to surveil plants and make them grow better, engage in play. This play is not about a game necessarily with predetermined rules, but rather the ontological concept of play as developed by Johann Huizinga, where play is the ultimate expression of freedom. It is the being in the world. It is the sort of precursor of understanding what bodies can do. in this particular situation, we looked for where plants would be able to express play in a way that through the robot as a prosthesis, we could enter this moment, like, so one of the things that plants do differently from us humans is that they are sort of living in a different time scale. And we can't, or we find it hard to move slowly, but a robot can easily do this. And a robot also can be asked to pay attention for a very long time and sort of still remember where the plant was, so to speak. And 15 minutes ago, very precisely. So we came up with this robot, and the robot obsessively looks at cucumber plants which grow, and alongside, as they grow, they produce with every new leaf also a tendril, and this tendril actually looks for something to hold on to. So depending on the environment, the morphology of the cucumber also changes. But this movement, this circummutation, the moment when it searches for something to grab onto, is quite is controlled in a non-obvious manner. So there's a lot of sensing of the environment that is not exactly known how it happens molecularly. So within this movement, this freedom that it has to explore the environment through movement, we intervene with the robot that, similarly like the plant has numerous tendrils, has numerous tendrils of its own, which are actually these balls that are at the end of wires, which it can move individually. So here we sort of see how the tendril wraps around the ball while the ball is not moving. But in general, this machine, this robot, continues to scan the plant with an imprecise vision. It creates an image of the plant, not an image, an imagination of the plant, and tries to then approach the plant without seeing precisely where it is and without reacting precisely to the image of the plant, but rather to the imagination it has of the plant. So this is sort of works, the machine works within a latent space of, it's not reacting directly to the plant, but intervening in the environment of the plant as it imagines the plant to be. And there's a lot of noise that happens there. And the plant constructs or has feeds back into this imagination of the computer, that the computer has of it, by changing the weights. So that's on the level of the computer. It's all about changing the weights, changing the matrix, influencing the calculations. But the result is actually unpredictable. The result is a situation where the morphology of both the computer algorithm, the position of the robot, and the plant kind of recursively constructs itself without a set goal and a set interest. So that is somehow how we imagined approaching this concept of play between a machine that is the prosthesis of a human and cucumbers. And so this was also a project that took a really long time to develop, because precisely because of interdisciplinary misunderstandings which I would be also kind of happy to talk about, because I think it's one of the things that creatures tries to approach. Like, how do you make these things work? How do you make it productive and constructive for social change? So I'll stop with this.
Great, thank you so much, Špela. And it seems we have a little bit more than 10 minutes for questions now. And maybe I would like to start with one question that has to do more with how the audience in your exhibitions and in your performances react to your works, and also to the methodology. So I understand that, or I assume that because of your background, you have a certain familiarity with kind of like scientific methods and like processes that you bring into your work. But do you think that audiences that lack this familiarity might find this process like rather intimidating, or like, you know, that they cannot understand, or that they are inaccessible? And how do you address this, you know, knowledge gap between you and the people who see your work?
Well, definitely it's something that needs a lot of attention. And I sort of see it as trying to give different points of entry, and also take care that regardless of the knowledge gap or the sort of context where you come from, you will be able to find a narrative or something that connects to you. So for example, here in play, it's first the first important moment of the visuality is actually the seemingly absurd bouncy balls that are colorful, that first of all hint that there's sort of like a game or play going on. There is a video that is processed in real time of the time lapse. So the interaction is visualized in this way. And there's also a narrator that sort of narrates this game in a seemingly associative manner. So even without understanding the complexity of AI, there's the invitation to imagine, in this case, the cucumbers as plants that have the capacity of play, that they are just like us, right? That there is no significant difference, or in many ways that they are like us. And then the question is, how do we actually construct a moral relationship to the organisms that are so important and like us in this sense?
Great, thank you. Is someone else has a question? Maybe just unmute yourselves and go ahead. Okay, maybe I go with another one then. Okay, Anne. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask something. I'm not so sure, because I have really big difficulties with going from a point where you tell that plants are like us. I don't think that's a good. Maybe I should show myself, because I'm doing like this, a good way to think about our relations and what is happening around us. And why do I say that? I do say that because even you and me, we don't know, we are not alike. I don't know you. The only thing I know is what my environment allows me to know. So why look for things that are the same, while things are all everywhere very different? it's not a real point. Maybe it's just a remark. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I've thought about this extensively, and actually, perhaps this was a shorthand to not go too much into what is actually at stake here. At stake is not whether we are similar or different, but what kind of relationship, what are the consequences of the sameness or difference that we choose to operate with. So there's two things. We are different. Okay, so this was all about confronting vegetal otherness and how we can have a caring, loving relationship to organisms that are at the core following different biological principles, different biological organization. And the question is about the ethics. We as humans have a, let's say, an evolutionary trick that serves us to navigate things that are different from us. It's called anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism, right? So it sort of presumes that there are certain qualities that we can see ourselves, that we can see have other creatures, other things, other principles having that we recognize, and there's sort of a patterning, and then that allows us to sort of predict how this entity will behave. And then on the other hand, we have science, and science says, well, what is it like to be a bat? You will never know, because we are not bats, and we will not know what it is like to be another person. And the further we go from our human form, the less we are capable and able to imagine. So the best thing to do is actually to respectfully create this gap, create this difference, and deal with these organisms as completely different. The problem with science is, and this kind of approach, is that it facilitates distance, a disconnection. It allows us to actually be, I think it's at the core of being able to treat other organisms as material. Therefore, I think anthropocentrism and living into plants has a role, not because it is true, but because of the consequences it has. Does that answer the question a bit?
That answers the question a bit. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Christina, if I am next, I will set off because I realise we're getting towards the end of the hour. I wanted to say something very appreciative of the presentation, because I've so often experienced even people who are very actively aware of human exceptionalism in terms of animals ignoring plants, and just how exciting it is to encounter your work and hear the detail. And I suppose I just wanted to commune a bit as much as ask a question, but I'm very reminded of sitting through a keynote presentation from somebody in a very large tech company that I won't name, whose kind of personal research was turning plants into musical instruments so that people could play them, because he wanted people to engage more with plants. And this very, I mean, while we may be stuck in our own forms and obliged to play with a plant in a way that we understand, you've gone so far to trying to understand what this interesting sort of spatial relation that plants have when they're trying to work out how to orientate to poles and things they might climb. It is very plant-centric, really, and just how that differs from this example of this guy producing something which, if you tap different leaves, sounded different. And it just feels like just another form of mindless exploitation of the natural world, and a failure to distinguish the difference between things that grow and things that are made, which does seem integral to this in some ways. So I just perhaps wanted to gush a bit and then ask for your comments.
I would just like to say that this is actually why I am driven so much to work with plants, because they continuously put me in a morally ambivalent position. So while I was defending this type of, plants are like us, I am not at ease with this at all. And I don't think that there is a way to be at ease with it. And sort of living within this tension is why I think this is so generative, right? Because it seems to me that this is at the core of how to live, actually. Not to be happy and sort of ethically content on an ethical high ground, but to understand the complexity and the ever-shifting territory that we're navigating. So that's precisely why I'm in love with them so much, because yeah, they're really hard to work with. I mean, to think and to be with.
Yeah, and we eat them. And we eat them without thinking about it as a problem, whereas we have a moral, I mean, not just an environmental concern, but a moral concern with eating creatures that we perceive to be living creatures, and yet we ignore the fact that plants are. So yeah, just.
Great, thank you. Is there another question? Maybe one last one? Do I see any hands up? No. Okay. I mean, I have one small last question about, I am trying to understand if your work is a kind of like exercise in empathy, or is this a kind of very agonistic effort to abolish all anthropocentrism, but also like any kind of centrism that might be out there, and also how we would. And also in terms of developing this type of communication that is not just a matter of translation, but it's kind of a matter of trying to find completely new, we have a completely new set of signifieds that are looking still for, signifiers out there. So, and I know you've tried to work with that before, so I was hoping that you can share a bit of your thoughts on this possibility of empathy and communication.
Yeah, partially, I think what I've concluded is that it's not about it's not about creating new avenues of empathy and communication, but recognizing the ones that we have. So this is more like about the signifiers and the signified, and this weird fascination or hope that we put into technology as if that is the key to opening. Right? The premise of this work that I talked about, play, is it's ironic that it needs to be conveyed through technology, because we are already predisposed to think that it will give us the answer, but it's really premised on something that already that is old, right? That is plants themselves. So I sort of have also an ambivalent relationship to the limitations or to what technology does to promote empathy, and in which ways does technology promote itself by disguising itself as promoting empathy. Yeah, it's not very optimistic, huh? But I don't know. I mean, I haven't given up. It is really about a continued questioning, I think.
Thank you. So, and I think our time for today is up. So I would like to thank you, Špela, for the wonderful presentation and the discussion, and also everyone else for joining. So please do mark the 30th of March in your calendars for our next seminar. And yeah, I hope to see you all very soon. Thanks a lot, Špela.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Really super. Thanks so much.